Welcome back to Developers Toolbox. Today we are starting a new series on encryption and hashing and hacking and security. So this being the first entry in this series, we're going to be talking a little bit about what encryption is, a brief history of cryptography. We're going to talk about kind of how cryptography works in general. It should be an interesting talk, not super practical, although there are certainly going to be a couple of practical aspects for consideration. But yeah, so we're just gonna start off with talking about cryptography a little bit more in general, and go through a little bit of a history lesson. So cryptography is the art of writing or solving codes. We use cryptography for hiding what a message might be, so that it's only decipherable to a certain recipient or set of recipients. I think everyone is sufficiently technical to have an idea of what encryption is. But just in case, let's talk about it a little bit. So encryption and cryptography are based around ciphers. So a cipher is any method of transforming a message to conceal its meaning. So taking something that could be understood and turning it into garbage in such a way that it can be turned back from garbage into something that can be understood at the other end with the intended recipients. So the word cipher is used synonymously with ciphertext or cryptogram. So that would be the message or the content of the message that's being disguised. And encryption, well, ciphers work generally through transposition and or substitution. So it could be one or both of those things. So what is transposition and what is substitution? Transposition is just rearranging characters such that the original content is all still there. It's sort of a shuffle type of operation, but in a different order, so kind of reordering of existing content. Whereas substitution is where you actually take a character and you replace it with a completely different character. So this is how ciphers work, and all encryption is really kind of based on this, or based around this concept. So let's take a look at what substitution looks like. Here's a simple substitution. And so in this key part of the substitution, we can see there's a plain text set of characters and then a corresponding ciphertext set of characters. So the first time that we use the character A, for example, we are going to replace it with the character C. And then if we use it again, we're going to replace it with the character 1. And so this table kind of dictates how characters will be encoded or encrypted using our keys, such that we get from a plain text message that's understandable to a ciphertext message that isn't understandable unless you have this key which you can use to decode it. So here's an encrypt operation, plain text. This is a secret message. So to encrypt this, we take a look at our key. So T maps to H. And we end up with H in our ciphertext. H maps to R, and we end up with the letter R in our ciphertext, and so on and so forth. The only place where this gets a little bit different is where we're using a second instance of the same character. So for the word secret, we have our S, which is substituted directly for F. We have E, which is substituted for T. We have a C, which is substituted to Y. And then we have a second E, so that kind of moves on here in the rotation. So this is also using transposition, sort of. But yeah, so basically you end up with this message, which obviously this makes no sense to anyone. It's just garbage. But when we do our decrypting portion of this, where we convert from garbage back into our plain text, we kind of do the opposite operation. So H, we look at where in ciphertext an H appears. That translates to a T, so we convert it back to a T, R to an H, and so on and so forth. So, so this is just simple substitution, and this is really kind of the root of how encryption works. Just in general, there's always some kind of key, and there's a series of substitutions and rotations and tumbling that occur to generate a an encrypted message, and then you kind of have to reverse those steps in most cases to get back to your plain text version of the message. And so only somebody who has the key knows how it was encrypted and can be decrypted. Yeah, so that's, I mean, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but at the root of it, this is how encryption works. So I think it's important, again, to kind of talk about, and a lot of these series, I tend to start off with a little bit of a history lesson and talk a little bit about where all these concepts kind of came from. So let's talk about the history of encryption and ciphers. So ciphers have been around for a really, really long time. In fact, some of the earliest ciphers have been found in hieroglyphics from as early as 1900 BC. Then throughout the ages, there's been a lot of different ways that encryption has been used. The Greeks had a device called a skatali, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that's what's pictured over kind of off to the side over here. So this is a device that would have a sort of a number of rotations associated with each position, and you would use this to encrypt your message by doing the preset kind of number of rotations. And so the Greeks actually had some pretty significant ciphertext methodologies for encrypting messages, and this is where, specifically during the time of the Greeks in 400, 500 BC, this is around the time that this kind of encryption was used to disguise military messages in particular. So that's a theme that prevails throughout the rest of the history, and we'll definitely be talking about that in more detail. But yeah, suffice it to say, I mean, the early Greeks were using this for their military, so it's not the idea of using a cipher to disguise the content of a message is not a new concept. And of course, the Romans, in late BC and early AD, they came up with the infamously named Caesar cipher, which is a very, very simple, extremely simple actually, transposition type of ciphering, where there's a fixed number of rotations that occur for each character in a message. So the original Caesar cipher that Caesar himself used was typically 3 rotations back. So if you were trying to encode the letter D, you would encode that as letter A, because A comes 3 positions before D. Or if you were trying to encode A, it would be X, because that's 3 positions before A if you roll backwards to Z and work your way back. And so, not everyone who has encoded messages with Caesar cipher has used back 3 positions as the means of doing that. It could be forward a number of positions, and that number could be kind of whatever. But that's the way a Caesar cipher works. It's a very simple cipher, and it's very easy to break. You can basically brute force a Caesar cipher manually pretty easily. But this is, obviously long before the time of electromechanical implementations of the same, other than the skatali device. I mean, there weren't really a lot of kind of ciphering machines or deciphering machines at this point. A lot of this was pretty much done manually, and that's kind of the way that ciphering went up until the late 19th, early 20th century. So in the late 19th century, a guy named Charles Babbage, who you guys may be aware of his existence or not, but he played sort of an important role in our history in terms of mathematics. He basically he created a Babbage machine, which was effectively the earliest version of kind of the calculators that we end up using today. But he also made a lot of important advancements in mathematics in general. But one of the things that he came up with was a means of using polyalphabetic substitutions and mathematical based enciphering. And so this was kind of the earliest versions of encryption as we know it today were created by Charles Babbage in the late 19th century. And of course, during World War I, the Germans were using this kind of mathematical based encryption to encode messages. There's a rather infamous or famous message called the Zimmerman telegram that was intercepted, cracked, and kind of used to gain a very strong tactical advantage rather. So yeah, this is like the kind of the first example of using mathematics outside of just kind of the simple kind of number of rotations or number of character changes or things like that types of encoding. And so then things got even more interesting during World War II. And again, a lot of this was kind of a lot of the technology for this was pushed forward by the Germans, although there were other there were certainly other nations that were developing similar kind of things. But this is when mechanical and electromechanical encryption first started gaining popularity, which of course is the foundation for doing computational kind of encryption. But it's still, everything kind of still goes back to it's still, encryption is still basically just ciphering. So doing those basic operations we talked about. It's just how you arrive at those has gotten more and more complex. And now, starting in World War II, we have machines that will handle enciphering and deciphering, or encrypting and decrypting for us. Prime example of that being during World War II, again, the Germans developed a device called the Enigma Machine. So this little guy is this is what an Enigma machine actually looks like. Yeah, so it's actually kind of an interesting device. It's electromechanical, and like I said, there were other nations that were developing machines that were very similar to this, but none were as widespread usage as the Enigma machine. And this was used during World War II by the Germans to really give the Axis a strong advantage in that they had some very interesting ways of encrypting their communications that were very difficult to break. And the way mechanically and electronically that an Enigma machine works is that there are a set of kind of plugs on the front where you basically connect one letter up to another letter, so that whenever I type this on this little keyboard piece, it's going to output that other letter that's tied to electronically by these little cables. And then there's a series of rotors, which you can kind of see at the top here, and these will dynamically change the way that the transposition works. So you might say if you start with an A, then on the next character you type, it's actually going to forward whatever your transposed character is up to 3 positions. But if you started with a D, it would forward 7 positions or something like that. There's basically these rotors are set in such a way that they'll kind of dynamically set the number of rotations in the direction and things like that. So this is a pretty advanced piece of equipment. It's mostly mechanical, but obviously the plug board is fully electronic. And the idea is that whenever you type a key, the actual output ciphertext the corresponding ciphertext character that should appear in the message lights up on this little board above, which also has all the characters on it. And so one person would be sitting there kind of typing out a message, and these lights would light up as they type, and another person would be transposing that ciphertext into physical documents or things that could be delivered. Again, this is still long before the electronic communications and things like the internet that could be used to transmit such messages. So there was still sort of the manual effort of getting it on paper and delivering it to the intended recipient. So the interesting thing, what made the Enigma machine so effective was not these complex mechanisms of having the cross connections and the adjustable rotors, but in the way that they did key rotations. So setting these plugs up and setting the initial settings for these rotors and these were swappable too. You could put different sizes in there, but that's basically if you think about what we've talked about with ciphertext and kind of how the simpler machines would encode a message and disguise its content. Historically, this is always been there's some key, right? And we talked about the importance of keys. There's some key that the source knows and the destination knows, but nobody in the middle knows, and that's the means of encoding and decoding your message. But the Germans with the Enigma machine were kind of the first example of key rotation that we've seen. So what they would do is there would be other secure channels that they would receive these messages every day that would tell them how to set up their machine. It would tell them what to cross connect, and these plugs were all changeable, and what routers to use and where to put them and all that kind of stuff. And so each day there would be a new key that would explain how to set up the machine for encoding and decoding messages for that day. And so even if, let's say, an American spy was able to intercept the key for a day, by the time they got it back to the Allies, and the Allies were able to use it to meaningfully encode or decrypt messages that the Germans were transmitting over, telegraph or even hand intercepting ciphertext messages themselves. By the time basically they were able to get any useful information about this, they would have a very limited window, and the next day the key would rotate. And so they would have to kind of start the process all over again. And of course, if the spies got caught intercepting these keys, then they were executed. And it was just, it was really not an ideal situation. It was very, very difficult to decipher these ciphered messages, to take this ciphertext and turn it into something meaningful to understand what the military strategy was on the German side and the Axis side. So the Allies decided to kind of take another approach to getting some kind of meaning out of these machines and not the machines, but the messages that were being transmitted, because they knew how these machines worked. And so there was basically a reverse engineering effort to intercept ciphertext and try and get something meaningful out of it. And at this point, there were certain intelligence organizations, mostly in Britain, but also in the U.S., that were working in this way. And what they would do is they would hire computers, which is, kind of a funny way of saying mathematician. It's basically this was the time before we had electronic computers, but there was still a concept of computers. It's just that these computers were people. And so they would hire these big rooms full of these expert mathematicians or computers, and they would take these ciphertext messages that they intercepted, and they would try various means of kind of reversing back through the different algorithms that were possible with this series of plugs and rotors, and try and get to the root of what the original message was, just by finding meaningful deciphering of individual characters. And so it was a very arduous process. And especially it's not just a matter with these rotors doing the tumbling and everything. It's not just a matter of finding out, oh, well, A maps to D. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Did A come after a B or after a P? And that might change the number of rotations that occur. So it's not just a direct character-to-character translation. It was very difficult to crack these codes. And so there were rooms full of people working on this problem. And ultimately, a very notorious expert computer named Alan Turing came up with a more viable solution to trying to crack these messages through brute force. So Turing came up with the idea of a machine that could basically automatically try different combinations of encoding and decoding algorithms to try and find something that was meaningful. And so this automatic machine putting this together was a huge endeavor, but it was very important because, first off, it could actually crack these codes in a reasonable amount of time, unlike the manual mathematicians who were just going through and trying things manually, and at the end of every day they'd have to reset and start over. So just having a machine do this eliminated a ton of effort, for one, and also made the actual decoding possible for another. So beyond that, the Turing machine is actually the foundation for modern day computers as well. So it was a very important advancement in technology, and this came out of the UK. The Turing machine, this is a representation from, I believe this picture is actually from a fantastic movie called The Imitation Game. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It goes into this concept in a whole lot more detail and kind of explains the history of Turing and the Enigma machine in much more detail than I'm doing here. But this is sort of the machine that the machine that they put together in the movie. This prop is actually a fairly realistic representation of what the original Turing machines looked like. They had these big rolls of magnetic tape. And the idea here is that you have a tape that's infinite in both directions, and you have a control unit that can store and retrieve state, and a head that can read and write to a position on the tape. And so you have these blocks on the tape that are all the same size, and you can move this entire unit to the appropriate block, or more accurately, move the block to the unit through tape rotation. And the unit can either read a value out of that and put it into one of its state positions, or it can write a value from one of its state positions to that tape. And so you could use this to create digital logic. This kind of, the way that this actually works goes back to our kind of recent series of talks on speaking computer. Just the whole idea that everything is a 0 or a 1, and that's how you not only store and retrieve data, but also how you determine logic for how you store and retrieve that data. And so this is really, the Turing machine is the most kind of simple representation of what a modern day computer actually is and does, and what a CPU is there for. So very, very interesting, but I don't want to digress too far into the Turing machine. I could talk about this in great detail, but the important thing is, as it pertains to the topic we're talking about now, is that this machine was able to crack these codes, and it was able to decrypt German communications. And so we were able to intercept these messages, and it actually gave the tactical advantage in the war to the Allies, and it's really the only reason why we won World War II is because of this machine. So the brilliant work of Alan Turing, who met an unfortunate end. Again, watch the movie, The Imitation Game, it's great. But yeah, so this is kind of the other thing that I wanted to mention with this is that up until this point, we've seen some mechanical machines, or we've seen simple machines, mechanical, electromechanical machines that do end-ciphering, but there wasn't, other than kind of wiring up an Enigma machine the same way to do the deciphering, there wasn't really a whole lot of this kind of brute force decoding that was mechanical. This was kind of the first instance of using a mechanical device or electrical or both kind of device to actually kind of brute force and try and reverse engineer an encrypted message. So really, I think one of the more important takeaways of this talk, and I do still have some topics to cover here, but one of the more important topics of this talk is the use of keys in encryption and the importance of securing a key. And so what things like this Turing machine were effectively doing is trying to brute force and figure out what that key is. But of course, the world of modern cryptography looks much different, and brute forcing keys is just not something that's really technically feasible at this point in time. So let's actually take a look at how modern cryptography works. So what's actually changed from these old kind of approaches to this problem? I mean, everything, as I've already said, cryptography is still based around ciphers, but we've really moved more into this. We've kind of expanded a lot on Charles Babbage's work, and come up with these really complex mathematical algorithms to handle encryption and decryption based on a cipher key. But now that key is, instead of being like a table that you can look at that tells you how to substitute numbers and how many character rotations you go through to change one character into another in ciphertext, instead of having these big tables, because we're basing this on a mathematical algorithm, we have a key that's actually a series of numeric values that we feed into an algorithm that specifies how the encoding is changed, or the behaviors of the encoding are changed based on that cipher, or based on that key, rather. So the way that our keys are represented are no longer as big and complicated, but they're actually more secure just because of the potential number of values that a key can have and the ways it can impact the behavior of an encoding algorithm. So keys are usually talked about as having some kind of bit value. So let's talk about a simple 8-bit encryption key. So this would be 8 bits, and we already know what bits are, again, from the speaking computer talk. This is just a series of 8 zeros and ones. And so we already know that you have 2 to the 8 possible values for an 8-bit key. So you have 256 unique keys. So if you were trying to brute force an encryption algorithm that used an 8-bit key, it wouldn't be too hard because you only have 256 different combinations to try, and one of them is probably going to yield some readable results. So you can pretty easily brute force an 8-bit encryption key as long as you know what the algorithm is that it applies to. So one of the earlier versions of these sort of computerized cryptographic ciphers was a system called DES. It always required a 56-bit key exactly, and so there were 2 to the 56 possible key values. So that is 72 quadrillion unique values. So obviously a little bit harder to brute force DES than it is to brute force a simple 8-bit key. And again, there's a lot of complex math involved here. I don't want to go too deep into the details, but suffice it to say, DES was a reasonably complex mathematical algorithm. Now, people have since found ways to break DES pretty easily, and so it's not used as widely as it once was. But early on, it was kind of adopted as a government standard in the U.S. and for a long time, the government kind of feared the capabilities of using some kind of cryptographic mechanism to create messages that they could not decipher. And there was another algorithm that went along with DES called 3DES or triple DES, and that was basically just using DES 3 times. There was a little bit more to it, but not much. But yeah, anyway, so these were considered good enough to create super secure messages, but the federal government still had the power to break these algorithms, and by the time we reached like the mid-late 90s, pretty much everybody could break these algorithms effectively. But the government was still advocating for them simply because anything more complex than this was too difficult for them to break. But we ended up with AES, which has different lengths of keys possible. You can actually use AES with an arbitrary length of key. It's one of the earliest algorithms to do this. And there's some others that have come since that are even more complex. But you can have a 128-bit key, a 192-bit key, a 256-bit key, a 512-bit key, a 1024-bit key, and so on and so forth. So you'll notice that these numbers are 2 to the power of n, kind of, because they're based on binary values, but they have to be of n length for the purposes of the AES algorithm itself and how it does encryption. So we've got some more complex ways of encrypting data now than we had before, but probably the most interesting thing that came out of modern cryptography and computerized cryptography is an idea of asymmetric keys, which is a different type of mathematical algorithms. All right, so the difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption. We've talked up until this point, pretty much everything we've talked about has involved symmetric encryption, where you have a key, and that key is used to encrypt a message on one end, and it's used to decrypt the message on the other end. And so your security is all based around the only people who know this key are the people who are transmitting the message and the people who are intended to receive the message. So asymmetric encryption, but the problem with that is first off, how do you transmit a key in a way that's secure to your destination? Like in the past, we talked about even up through World War II, like a lot of the encrypted messages themselves, the ciphertext was kind of hand delivered. And the same thing with the Enigma machine. We talked about the secure channels there and the challenges involved in the Germans actually transmitting keys to everyone every day to tell them how to set up their machines. So the idea with asymmetric encryption is that maybe there's a way that I can transmit my key to you without actually physically handing it to you over the internet, but with the key itself being encrypted in some way, so that it's disguised and not everybody has my key. So the idea with asymmetric encryption versus symmetric encryption is that instead of just having one key, you have a set of keys. One key that you make publicly available and one key that you make privately available. Or don't make available, I guess, would be a more accurate way to say that. So with these key pairs, you have a key that gets exposed publicly and one key that you're not supposed to expose that you keep to yourself. That works more like, you want to disguise that kind of like you do with your traditional symmetric encryption keys. You don't want people to get their hands on your private key. And the way that the algorithms involved work in asymmetric encryption is that messages that are encoded with the public key, or messages that are encrypted with the public key, can only be decrypted by the private key. And messages that are encrypted by the private key can only be decrypted by the public key. And so this makes things possible like what we have with modern day SSL and TLS. So this is a very oversimplified representation. There's actually a lot more to it than this, but this is basically how TLS works. Well, TLS and SSL. So you may be aware that TLS and SSL are based around certificates. Well, the certificate has certain claims in it. It gives you certain information. But the most important thing that a certificate does is it is a public key. And so there's a couple different, and anyone who knows anything about TLS and SSL knows that there's a couple different reasons to use TLS or SSL. These are not, SSL and TLS are not encryption mechanisms themselves. They are a protocol. They're a protocol that kind of dictates how transmission and control of messages works. But TLS or SSL can use different enciphering mechanisms under the hood, or cipher suites. If you've heard the term cipher suites, it's basically, here's a list of encryption algorithms that I'm okay with using. And so TLS basically tells you how your client and the server, or your sender and recipient, are allowed to communicate. If the sender says, I'm okay with these two mechanisms, and the server says, I'm okay with these two mechanisms, and one of those, there's a commonality with one item between those two, that's the one that's used. And there's orders of preferences and things like that. But that's an important distinction. SSL and TLS are not encryption themselves. They're protocols that dictate how the encryption is to work. So anyway, as far as the encryption itself goes, though, TLS and SSL do two different things. They encrypt the channel between a sender and a receiver, so they handle the actual encryption, but they also are used for identity validation. So how does that work? So the identity validation is based on a certificate authority. So a certificate authority is just an organization that is trusted. We know what their public certificate looks like, and we know that we can trust them. But then you may want to communicate with somebody who is not a certificate authority. Like, let's say that Google is not a certificate authority, but I want to talk to Google via my web browser, right? So I need some third party to tell me that the certificate being presented by Google is in fact Google's certificate. And again, when I say certificate, this is all interchangeable with public key. It implies some other things, but for the purposes of this conversation, it is a public key. So the first thing that happens, there's a setup process to actually get a certificate on your web server or your device or whatever's hosting. So the web server has a private key, which again, this does not get exposed. It uses that private key to encrypt a message that has some details about who's requesting the certificate and blah, 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 that sort of thing. Basically, this is just a message called a certificate signing request that part of it gets encrypted by this key, and it gets transmitted to a certificate authority server. And the certificate authority server will then validate that the person who gave them the key is who they said they are, either through some kind of DNS ownership validation, through a phone call, through a letter, and some older cases. Anyway, it's the whole point is that there's a validation process that occurs here where the certificate authority is the one that says, yes, the person who owns this private key that signed this message is who they say they are. And so what they'll do is then they'll take the certificate that's generated based on that private key signing from the web server, and they will sign it themselves. They'll re-encrypt over top of it with their private key, and then they'll transmit that back to the owner of the web server. So at this point, we've got a certificate on the web server that's been, the signed portion has been encrypted with the CA's private key and with our private key underneath of that. And so that kind of completes the setup process. We now have this certificate or public key that's kind of doubly signed that we can present. So now what happens when I go to, let's say this web server again is google.com. Let's say I'm in my web browser and I go to google.com and I'm contacting it over HTTPS, which is using TLS transport over for HTTP. So the first thing that happens is that the browser will get the certificate back from the web server, and it will inspect that certificate to ensure that it was signed by the CA. And how do we know that it was signed by the CA? Well, because we have a copy of the CA's certificate, or we can easily get one from them. And the messages that were signed with this private key can only be decrypted by this public key. So we can use the CA's certificate to verify that it was in fact signed by their key and that this web server here is trustworthy because the CA validated that they are who they say they are. Then the next thing that happens, and this is an approximation, there's actually a much more involved process here, but just for the sake of keeping this simple, we'll say that the browser generates its own little private key, and it encrypts that using the web server's public key, being the certificate. And then it will transmit that over that secure channel to the web server and say, hey, here's the key that you can use to talk to me. And of course, that message is encrypted as well by the web server's certificate, that message, again, can only be decrypted by the web server's private key. So the web server gets this message that only it can decrypt, and that includes a random number, basically, or a random key that it can use to send messages to the browser. The browser has the corresponding public key for that. If it's a key pair, or if it was symmetric, it would just use that key to decrypt messages that come back from the web server. But you see now you have two-way encrypted communication between this browser and this server, and they've basically found a way to privately exchange a key without having to have some kind of physical handoff. The last thing that I want to talk about, promise this is the last slide, is key exchange using the DiffieHellman algorithm. So a couple pretty bright mathematicians, Diffie and Hellman obviously, came up with this idea of doing a kind of a super secure way of getting two machines to come up with a secret that they can use just between those two machines for the purposes of communication over a public transported network like the internet. So this actually does play into the TLS stuff in the way that it actually works. But it's used in aspects other than that. It's just very commonly used with TLS, but there's other kind of encryption protocols that can also implement DiffieHellman. It's just a methodology for getting a common shared secret that nobody else is aware of. And so the best diagrams I've found to illustrate this use paint, but this is actually mathematical things that are happening here instead. Think of these could be numbers, and they're numbers and algorithms actually, but yeah, the paint actually makes it pretty obvious what's going on. So first off, there's a common number that everybody knows about. This is out in the open, and we might say we agree on, well, common color. Let's say we agree on yellow. We're going to use yellow as our common color. And now each one of us generates a secret color. So Alice in this conversation generates orange, and she doesn't say anything to anyone, to include Bob. Nobody knows what her secret color is. And Bob comes up with green. Same thing again. Only Bob knows what green is. And so they will take this common secret, and they will take their common key and combine it with their secret to come up with what they're able to transmit over the public network, basically. And so we can't derive from this kind of peach color. We can't derive that. We know that yellow was used. If we're outside this communication, we're not Alice and Bob, we're just listening in the middle. We know that yellow was used, and we know that there's a peach here, but there's no way to separate out and determine that she used orange to make this into peach. But anyway, so we can't separate these into the secret color. And so these get transmitted, kind of cross-transmitted. Alice sends her public transport a mixture here to Bob, and Bob sends his to Alice. And then they combine with their secret color on each side, which gives them the common secret. And so you end up with this secret, this brown color that nobody is aware of except for Alice and Bob, just through this whole transmission process. So that's DiffieHellman, high level. There's a lot more. There's a lot better explanations of DiffieHellman out there in terms of how the mathematical formula and numbers are determined. So you can look that up if you're interested in the topic, and it's not super relevant to the conversation, but I did want to point it out. So.